My wife cheated on me with a 15-year friend during my work trip. I confronted them, got my revenge. I'm Steve, and my wife's Kate. We've been married for more than 3 years. The first year was really happy, the second was good, and the third had some issues. It might seem silly or childish. I can't say I disagree, but I'm not sure if you would react differently. We were in the middle of an argument. We've had a lot of those lately, Kate and I, but this one was really bad. I don't even know what it was about, something small like the laundry or an unpaid bill. Kate has this habit of bringing up irrelevant complaints during arguments, things that have nothing to do with what we're fighting about. It could be stuff from years ago, like when I didn't pick up her sister from a party, or just random things that occur to her to hit me with. This was one of those times. And you just never stop talking. Do you know that, Steve? She said this in a harsh tone. Nothing makes you happier than the sound of your own voice, even when we're, in bed. There was silence. Kate must have seen from my face that she went too far. I was hurt, so I just looked at her. I thought about saying I had no idea my talking during closeness bothered her. It's how I express my love and excitement. But then I decided not to say anything. Kate continued, saying my talking distracts her during closeness and turns her off. I was surprised. Why hadn't she mentioned this before? We've been married for over 3 years, and I thought she enjoyed my affectionate words. She talked less than I did in bed, but she always said a few words. After a long silence, I stood up and told Kate I'd try to only speak when it's important. Then I left the room. Update, I wasn't proud of my actions afterward. All I can say is I felt really hurt. The unexpected argument hit me hard. I thought if she wanted silence, then she would get silence. Our fights were getting worse. Despite still loving Kate, we found it harder and harder to be content with each other. There were fewer happy times and more tense moments, and arguments over small things. A major issue was my job as a sales rep for a plumbing supply company, requiring me to travel for about 3 weeks, 4 days a month. Kate didn't like me being away so much, but she knew this before we got married. She also wanted to start a family, which I resisted for another 2 years. I expected a promotion that would let me stop traveling. I just didn't want to have a baby until I could be home all the time. So those were the big issues. Lately, even tiny things seemed to trigger fights. The reservoir of love and goodwill seemed almost empty, and I didn't know why. One thing Kate said kept bothering me, that my talking during closeness was the opposite of what turned her on. Did that mean she was enjoying closeness with someone else? Someone who didn't talk, it seemed far, fetched until I thought about it more? During my last trip, about 10 days. Earlier, I couldn't reach her on the phone twice. The second time, she had her cell phone switched off when she should have been back from work. The next day, she said she went for a beer with friends, which seemed reasonable, except I called the house around 10:30 and she was still out. Also, in the past month, 3 times I answered the phone and the person hung up. Not a big deal, but it rarely happened before, so I got more suspicious and took action. For the next 2 weeks, Kate probably thought she was living with a mute. No small talk, no idle conversation, no words unless absolutely necessary. Instead of saying, "Could you pass the salt, honey?" I got up and got it myself. In response to, "What's the weather going to be like today?" I passed her the weather page of the newspaper. If she asked me to make dinner that night, all she got was, "Okay." When she left for work and said, "Goodbye, honey," I gave her a smile and a wave. It became a game to see how few words I could say to her in a day. Kate knew I was angry and hurt, and she knew why. At first, she didn't seem to care much, but after that, she started trying to make up. She didn't exactly apologize, that was rare in our house, but she became much more affectionate. Kisses greeted me in bed in the morning, on the way out for work, and at bedtime. Sometimes she leaned over to give me a hug while I was reading the paper over coffee in the morning, or rubbed my shoulders while we were watching TV. It was a funny thing, even as my anger gradually calmed down and nobody can stay white-hot angry over days, I kept saying as little as possible. Before speaking, I'd ask myself if I really needed to say it, and usually the answer was no. I was listening more, observing more, and keeping my thoughts to myself. About 10 days after the argument, Kate suggested we make love. Whether she wanted to or it was part of making up, I couldn't tell. After dinner, during which she told me some stories about work and I spoke no more than 6 words, she stood up and took me by the hand, urging me to leave the dishes for later. With a big, warm smile, she conveyed that there was something else she needed at that moment. As she led me back to the bedroom, I wondered if the distance between us had grown because of my silence, or if I was silent because we had already drifted so far apart. During the entire encounter, I hadn't uttered a word. As we coupled smoothly, easily, and familiarly, I remained completely silent, feeling a sense of unnatural coldness and distance. I wasn't even sure if it was what Kate truly wanted, but after that argument, I had no intention of saying a word. After we finished, I rolled off her, and she snuggled into me, emitting a happy, Without any verbal communication, we relaxed together for a while, still without exchanging any words. I couldn't discern what the experience had been like for her. For me, it felt cold and empty, and whether that was due to the silence or the growing distance between us remained uncertain. Update: after a few more days of minimal conversation, Kate became upset with me. One night during dinner, she expressed frustration, questioning my silence and whether I had anything to say. After a moment of thought, I responded that I thought this was what she wanted. She clarified, explaining that she desired a husband who communicates and shares feelings, not someone resembling a mannequin from a department store. Privately, I chuckled, thinking, "Good one, Kate." Last week she had complained about me talking too much, so I was making an effort to rectify that. Kate accused me of taking the silent treatment too far, labeling it the Silent Sam routine. I looked at her for a moment before speaking. Some of my confusion was intended to annoy her, and partly, I was genuinely puzzled. I honestly didn't know what she wanted. First, I talked too much, then, too little. How am I supposed to know what to do now? She glared at me, clearly very angry, insisting that I stop and be the man she married. I regretted my earlier words, stating that she doesn't talk too much. We were arguing. I was upset, and I just threw that at her. After a pause, I added, "All right, Kate, but I have to admit, your words got me thinking that maybe I do talk too much, or without thinking first about whether I really have anything to say." After a moment, I smiled at her, saying, "In a way, all this has been helpful." She smiled back warmly, her anger seemingly gone, and for a moment I felt the closeness between us that had been missing. I then brought up the topic of making love, genuinely seeking to understand. I asked if she meant what she said about not talking during closeness. Rather than answering my question, Kate left the table. For the rest of the evening, she gave me the cold shoulder, which didn't seem fair despite my honest attempt to understand her feelings. The next morning brought a more hopeful atmosphere. Kate had stepped back from her initial attack, expressing a desire for communication. Unfortunately, her focus remained on the end of the conversation, evident in her glares and tight-lipped phrases at breakfast. We endured a few more days of minimal communication, ironic this time, as she was giving me the silent treatment. After 3 to 4 days, Kate's mood drastically changed again. She came home from work looking very upset and headed straight for the shower. Over dinner, she was distracted, saying little and frequently losing track of my conversation. This wasn't the angry, silent treatment anymore. She was clearly preoccupied with something. But when I asked her if something was wrong, and I asked several times, she only mentioned a problem at work. I noticed, though, that she wouldn't meet my eyes when she said it. Unsure of what was bothering her, I decided to wait and see. The next day, I received a call at work. Ernie Matazzo confirmed my suspicions about Kate having an affair. I thanked him, left work, and went home. Looking at the photos, the only surprise was the guy, Adam, who hadn't been my best man but was one of my groomsmen. He'd always admired Kate, and I'd never considered him a threat. I felt cold and empty, like the last time Kate and I were in bed together. I sat for a long time, contemplating everything, and pulled out the photos, finding them unchanged from the first time I put them away. Update: when Kate arrived home, she found me seated on the couch, seemingly idle. I remained quiet as she greeted me, my expression crafted to appear neutral rather than angry. Her inquiry about my unusual behavior grew more pointed, a blend of concern and annoyance evident in her edgier tone as she probed further, sensing that something was amiss. I maintained my silence. Frustration welled within her as she pressed for an explanation, insinuating a return to the silent treatment of the past. In response, I sat up, cutting through the tension with a direct question. I asked her how long she had been dating him. Kate, taken aback, recoiled in shock and retreated a step. Perplexed, she took a seat across from me, seeking to understand my accusation. Her attempts to read my expression proved futile. The atmosphere thickened as she continued to deny any involvement with someone else, clasping her hands tightly in her lap as she implored me to reveal the source of my accusations. Her plea, laden with frustration, suggested that I harbored a guilty conscience. Unyielding, I presented an envelope containing a photograph, a damning image of Kate on Adam's bed. She looked at it briefly, dropped it in surprise, and recoiled as though it were a threat. Blushing, she retreated into her chair, avoiding eye contact. In the face of my persistent silence, she decided to change the subject, heading for the bedroom. However, I intercepted her with the incriminating photo. She hesitated, and unable to escape my unrelenting gaze, she finally met my eyes with a silent plea. "How long?" I reiterated. Her response was a withdrawal into herself, arms wrapped tightly around her as she shook her head. The silence lingered, and she eventually appealed to me, requesting that I spare her from discussing the matter. Declaring my decision to leave, I moved toward the bedroom to pack. In a desperate plea, she implored me to wait, promising to disclose everything. Relenting, I resumed my seat, observing her as she struggled to maintain eye contact. Unable to endure the silence, she confessed, apologizing and expressing remorse as she pleaded with me not to leave. I remained seated, meeting her gaze with an unwavering expression. She averted her eyes, and after a moment, she mustered the courage to look back at me, tearfully admitting that Adam had told her I was also involved. Surprised, I refrained from questioning her and gestured for her to continue. Kate explained that a month earlier she had encountered Adam at the supermarket. He, being charming and friendly, had offered her companionship in my absence, arriving at our house with pizza and wine. They spent a casual evening together, misled by Adam's claim that I too was engaged in similar actions. Towards the end, he started acting worried and concerned. When Kate questioned him about it, he claimed I had been unfaithful. He did an impressive job at acting, appearing reluctant, with his head hanging, avoiding an eye contact with me. According to him, you and he had a conversation a couple of weeks earlier where you confessed about a girl you were involved with during your trips. He provided convincing details about her appearance, where you met, and how great you said she was in bed. I started crying, and Adam consoled me, expressing admiration for my beauty and how he couldn't fathom how any man could cheat on me. A little while later, we ended up in bed together, and I only found out yesterday that the entire story was false. I waited, expressionless. She continued, her expression now more somber than before. I found myself in his apartment, she said. After he had this smug demeanor. He brought up the notion that if it weren't for your involvement with Julia, we wouldn't have realized how well we connect. I raised the issue of inconsistency, reminding him that during our initial conversation about your supposed lover, he had mentioned the name Joanne. He couldn't recall any of the details, like her appearance or how you met. Frustrated, I screamed at him to tell me the truth. Did you really cheat on me? He laughed, admitting it was just a story to get me into bed. Kate's face turned red with anger. I got up, threw on my clothes, and berated him, calling him out for making a fool of me, she continued. He just lay there, smiling, unapologetic and unremorseful. I couldn't believe what I had done. She trailed off, her voice choked with emotion, and then she broke down, sobbing with her face in her hands, her body heaving. The urge to comfort Kate was overshadowed by a cold emptiness. Was she truly that naive, or had our love deteriorated to the point where she was willing to believe even the most absurd stories? And then there was my rage at Adam, a friend of 15 years. I sat in silence while Kate sobbed. After about 5 minutes, I stood up. Kate watched me fearfully as I took her cell phone from her purse, put it in my pocket, and went to the bedroom and kitchen, unplugging the phones and putting them in a bag under my arm. Before departing, I glanced back at Kate and conveyed that I would return. I instructed her not to leave and cautioned against engaging in conversations with anyone. Despite my quiet tone, she appeared terrified and affirmed my instructions with a nod. Update on the way to Adam S. I focused on controlling my breath to appear calm and friendly. When Adam opened his door, he seemed surprised and nervous. Without hesitation, I invited him for a couple of beers and suggested watching the Phillies, saying Kate was at a meeting. Though he observed me carefully, he put on a friendly demeanor and agreed to my proposal. We sat in his living room, chatting amiably while the game played in the background. Keeping the conversation light, I noticed Adam gradually relaxing, thinking it was a casual visit. However, I remained uncertain about the situation. It took more than an hour to steer the conversation toward relationships. I inquired about the ladies he was dating, making him momentarily nervous, but my reassuring smile prompted him to share details about a girl from work he'd been seeing casually. I mentioned a talkative college girlfriend, and Adam took the bait, agreeing that actions speak louder than words during intimate moments. Laughing, he boasted about revealing the desires of many girls, expressing satisfaction. Leaning in, I asked about Kate's preferences, catching him off guard. After a moment of shock, he tried to laugh it off, but I kept pressing him with a smile. He finally agreed to be quiet, looking at me fearfully. Expressing my disbelief, I confronted him about betraying our friendship and deceiving my wife to have an affair with her. Downplaying it, he claimed it wasn't a big deal, arguing, she's just a woman. He trailed off uncertainly, looking at my face. Staring at him in disbelief, I questioned how I had ever been friends with him. Asserting that things were better out in the open, I insisted he tell me everything about his deceitful game with Kate. Having already talked to her, I warned that lying wouldn't work. Wide-eyed and genuinely afraid, Adam nodded at me, signaling his readiness to talk. He recounted the story, aligning closely with what Kate had said. He had always found her attractive and had been flirting with her for several months whenever he encountered her. He was single. One week he bumped into her at the supermarket and saw his chance. Initially thinking he could seduce her, he fabricated a story about my affair. When it became apparent she wouldn't, he cheat on me. He deliberately angered her and made her feel sorry for herself, making it easier to get her into bed. They met about 5 more times, always at his place. The first encounter was great because she was upset about my alleged affair, she cried. However, the subsequent times were fantastic, exactly as he described. When he noticed my disapproval, he abruptly stopped talking. I had cut his hair almost to the roots by then, finding satisfaction in picturing him hiding his head with hats for weeks. Coldly, I inquired if it was over. After a brief hesitation, he admitted it was and shared that she found out about the fabricated story. Unable to recall the name of the supposed girl I was dating, she got angry and left. I was ready to leave, feeling empty. Although I could have pressed for more details, I decided against it. I informed Adam that our friendship was over, warning against retaliation. We agreed not to involve the police. He nodded, looking more humiliated than angry, and requested to be released. Smiling, I assured him I'd leave the apartment door open, allowing him to free himself in about an hour. I walked away without turning back. Update: upon my return, Kate was seated on the couch in her bathrobe, her wet hair indicating recent distress. As I moved around the apartment, fixing the phones, she remained visibly scared and unhappy. Taking a seat across from her, we exchanged glances, but I maintained my silence. Eventually, she inquired about my actions, to which I explained the conversation with Adam, assuring her that I hadn't. T resorted to violence and expressing doubt about hearing from him anytime soon. Despite acknowledging that she almost wished I had confronted him physically, she recognized the potential consequences. Troubled, she sought to move past the situation, admitting her foolishness and asking for forgiveness. I looked at her for a prolonged moment before responding, our pattern of saying very little to each other becoming a habit. I dawned to know, I finally replied, and it was an honest admission. Tears welled up in her eyes as she began to cry. The following morning, Kate entered the kitchen, expressing delight at the breakfast and coffee set on the table. Her joy faded abruptly upon noticing the 2 large suitcases near the door. Distraught, she questioned my departure, pleading with me not to leave. Instead of leaving without a word, I served her a cup of coffee and persuaded her to sit across from me. Kate, it's over, I declared. I admitted uncertainty about what had transpired or why, but emphasized that our relationship had deteriorated. Despite acknowledging our initial compatibility, I highlighted a year of impatience, snappiness, and constant fighting. I pointed out that her choice to believe Adam's dubious story about my infidelity and her subsequent actions indicated a departure from the woman I had married. I suggested she must have been on the verge of straying for our relationship to reach this point. Pausing, I waited for her response, but she cried silently, holding her face in her hands. When I ceased speaking, she looked up at me pleadingly. I offered her an opportunity to speak, to prove me wrong, to outline a path to revive our love. Regrettably, she remained silent, merely gazing at me and crying. I headed to the door, bidding her farewell as I picked up my suitcases and departed.